Hello, Comsers. I hope you all are having a great time. My name is Ståle Hansen, and I'm the producer for this session. As always, please ask your questions in the Q&A. I will go through them and post them to Peter at the end of this session. And if you don't have time for all the questions, we will repost them in the breakout session. This session is called Teams, Office 365 Groups, and Modern Sites Provisioning and Governance with SPFx, Logic Apps, and Azure Automation. And this really shows how fast the cloud moves, because it's not called Office 365 Groups anymore, it's Microsoft 365 Groups. So this session will be presented by Peter Carson, and take it away, Peter.
Thanks, Dolly. Yes, we actually did a quick edit literally 4 minutes before the session, did the search and replace, because I always catch myself calling it Office 365 still, but the brand is now Microsoft 365. That's the go forward from that point of view. And this talk is around Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, and modern sites. You know, how do you provision them? How do you put governance around that from that point of view? Before we dive into the session, I always want to give a thank you to all the various different vendors that are sponsoring Comsverse, making the event possible. We're actually a sponsor ourselves, Extranet User Manager. We're down in the Expo Hall. So if you're feeling brave and you want to try out AltSpace VR, which is a cool way to experience a virtual Expo Hall, it's actually quite immersive, even on a 2D interface on a PC. But if you've got a full, Oculus Rift or immersive, it's even better from that point of view. I actually put a blog post up on my blog site, blog.petercarson.ca, just talking about how you set that up and get into that environment. So in terms of agenda, what we're going to cover over for the next sort of 35 minutes or so, I'll do a little bit of introduction on myself, some background on what led us to the solution that I'm going to be describing here. Around provisioning, we'll do a lot of demo as part of that, and we'll touch a little bit on external sharing as part of that. I did a previous talk. I'm in Eastern Standard Time in North America. I'm just outside of Toronto in Canada. It was 7 a.m. my time, 5 or noon, I guess, UK time on external sharing. But there is a lot of connection between what I'm going to be talking about here today and that side as well. So as mentioned, Peter Carson, president of Extranet User Manager, also in Office Apps and Services, Microsoft MVP. I just got my 10th annual renewal from Microsoft on July 1st. So happy, hit the decade mark. It's a great group to belong to. Lots of like-minded peers globally around the world that are part of that MVP program, as well as, of course, the strong Microsoft team back in Redmond. Didn't have an MVP summit this year because of COVID. Hoping to, maybe we'll get together physically next year. Not sure where everything's playing out, but virtual conferences seem to be the way it's going for the time being through here. And excited to be part of Comsverse here. Now, I'm going to go through a fair bit of content in the next half hour or so. I do have a lot of additional resources, though, up on our Extranet User Manager site. So I've got a couple links on the bottom of the deck here. If you go to the short link on the lower right there, that eum.co, that'll get you into our site. If you go into the events section under resources, you'll actually find an event page for Comsverse itself. I'm actually posting these decks up in there. They'll be posted as part of the Comsverse site, and the recordings will also be available through Comsverse as well. I'd like to start the talk with a slide I used to use just as Modern was coming out on the SharePoint Online side, that we've kind of morphed into the Teams side of it as well. And the reason that we did that is that Teams and SharePoint are very much joined at the hip. So when you create a team, you get a modern team site under the hood as part of that. As you have channel conversations in the middle here, within those teams, any documents that you're collaborating on as part of that team live in those modern team sites. Likewise, when you have one-on-one or group chats through the chat features, any documents that you're sharing there happen in your OneDrive for Business, which is private by default, but gets shared out to members of the chat if you're sharing those documents through that chat conversation. And then you've still got communication sites on the right here. I mean, those aren't connected to Teams per se. They're more for broad-based sort of one-to-many publishing to a broader audience. We're actually going to focus in on the center part here, which is the formal teams and channels within Microsoft Teams and the corresponding team sites that live underneath that. So this is an infographic Matt Wade, fellow MVP, created, I think last year sometime. I quite like it because it does a good job of explaining as I create something in the top here, like I create a net new team through the self-service in Microsoft 365, it's going to create a bunch of different resources under the hood here. Yes, it will create a team and a team's wiki. Honestly, first thing I tend to do when I create a team is turn off the wiki. I'm not a fan of it. I'm a huge fan of OneNote, and I like to use the OneNote. So I typically add a tab into Teams for the Teams OneNote that's created in the underlying SharePoint site. I feel like I'm repeating the word team too often, but it's just a nature of the product name choice that Microsoft made when they named the product. But likewise, I can create a Microsoft 365 group through Outlook, through Planner. I can create a modern team site, which will create a Microsoft 365 group, and it'll create many of these elements through here. I won't get a team as part of that, but I'll get all the other components through there. And in fact, now when you create a modern team site through the SharePoint interface, one of the first things that happens is you get a little toast in the lower left corner of your new modern team site saying, hey, would you like to create a team as part of that? So they really want you to use them together as part of that, which I'm a fan of. And you've also got a shared inbox, shared calendar happening in Exchange as part of that as well. And one of the things we encourage clients to do is there's a lot of different components here. You may not choose to use all of them. I don't encourage you to use email, Teams chat, and Yammer all on the same project. It's too many different ways to communicate. So figure out what to use when, and kind of standardize that within your organization. Doesn't mean that everything has to be all Teams. There's scenarios like when you're dealing with external parties and bringing them into your team, maybe doesn't make sense, and email still does. So figure out what that balance is and how that's working. Now, often when we're talking to clients, we think of teams and team sites as project sites. That's sort of a common concept that makes sense to everybody. But one of the first discussions, and I guess I should back up a bit, in addition to Extranet User Manager, the parent company of that is actually Envision IT. We're a consulting company focused on Microsoft 365 consulting. And as we come into organizations, in the past, we talked a lot about SharePoint information architecture because that was our background. We've been doing SharePoint work for many, many years now. That's kind of shifted more recently, that it's a very Teams-focused conversation to say, well, what does a team represent in your organization? What does a channel underneath a team represent? And then flesh out the SharePoint information architecture from that. But this concept of project sites is one that resonates with most people, as it is the context for this talk here. And I have a wish list. I've been giving this talk since 2015 when it was purely SharePoint, and then what was then called Office 365 groups came onto the scene, and then later Teams came in. It sort of morphed and adapted from there. And I'm a big fan of using Microsoft Teams for project member communication. So what we do at Envision IT when we're doing consulting engagements with our clients is we've decided a team represents a client, and then projects that we do for that client represent channels. That's sort of the IA that we've built on the team side. Doesn't mean that's right for everybody. That's what's right for us. So we're going to have a team for every client in there, and all the project communication that goes on around that client's work happens in that team, and all the relevant people at Envision IT. We're not a big organization. We're a company of 17 people. Happens within that team. Now we'd like to have sort of a templated SharePoint team site as part of that team. So you get a modern team site out of the box, but let's go a little further. Let's set up multiple document libraries. We like to invite our clients into the modern team site. We don't make the members of the full-fledged team. Flipping between Teams tenants for our clients is going to be too confusing. So we stick with email there, but we do want them to be able to come into a shared documents library, whereas we have a separate private documents library where stuff is private only to us, that we're not necessarily ready to share with the client just yet. So having that structure there, and some site columns, some content types, some custom views and things like that is a great starting point. And if that's done in a consistent way across every project site, then as you move from project A to B to C, it's very easy to understand where to look for things because it's all done in a consistent way. And it's not about rigidly enforcing standards. It's about kind of pre-baking that so that when people come in and they start working with a new client and a new project, all that structure is there already. So it's actually easier to work within that structure than to create your own ad hoc one outside of that. And the idea there is more of a carrot than a stick to say, hey, we're not going to force you. You can do your own thing, but you know what? It's actually a lot easier if you just follow the standard through there, and then everybody understands where everything goes from there. I'm a huge fan of OneNote from an ad hoc note-taking point of view. So I like the fact that a OneNote gets created in every modern team site. And one of the first things we do is we put tabs into Teams. For that OneNote, we get rid of the wiki tab, as I mentioned before. We don't always use Planner, but some projects we use Planner from a simple task management point of view. We do a lot of recordings of calls that we have around projects that we're running for clients. So those automatically get recorded into Stream. We don't have the API support yet from Microsoft to be able to automate some of the things I'd like in Streams, because Streams does have a concept of channels, just like Teams has channels, but they're actually disconnected from each other. They're completely independent. But what we can do is go over in the Stream and create a channel that corresponds to the Teams channel, and then put a tab in Teams that points to that Stream channel. So when we make a recording on a particular project, we know to go in Teams to that Streams tab, and we can find all the recordings. Just a much easier way to work. We've still got Exchange from an external communication point of view. We may have external systems in there from that perspective. So let me show you what that actually looks like. I'm going to go into our live Teams tenant that we use at Envision IT, and we have teams for our functional departments within the company. We have a consulting group within, we have a technical development team. We've got our traditional, HR management and so forth from there. And this one at the top is a representative example of a client that we're working with. It's actually not a paid client. It's a philanthropic project that we're doing called VRX Therapy. I actually gave a talk last night as part of Commsverse in AltSpace VR about how we're using VR to help with pain management from a chronic pain point of view, particular to spinal cord injuries or amputees where they have what's called phantom pain. So, we've got a number of different projects running under that. We've implemented our Extranet user manager product in that. We're using SharePoint Spaces, which is a virtual immersive space that Microsoft has created within SharePoint. It's pretty cool. If you haven't checked it out before, encourage you to go to vrxtherapy.org. You can actually register and come into our SharePoint Spaces and try it out. And there's the actual website as part of that as well. But if I come into the general tab here, I can see we've set up all these tabs. We've got our posts, we've got our files that has all of our documents in there. We don't have the wiki tab in there, but we do have OneNote. And what we do is we structure the OneNote the same way we structure our Teams channels. So if I expand this out to see the navigation, you'll see we have sections in OneNote that correspond to the channels in Teams, and each of those channels in Teams has a tab that points to the particular OneNote for that. So it becomes very easy to navigate around and figure out where are the jot notes related to this, what are some of the project highlights and URLs and Microsoft contacts that we're working with on the SharePoint Spaces side of things. It's all there for us in the OneNote. We can have conversations around here. We can paste links to particular pages and make that part of the Teams conversation. And likewise with Stream, I can see all of the call recordings for any of the calls that we've had, jump into those in Streams, play them back, go to particular points, search through the transcript. So that all becomes very valuable. And then this particular project we are using Planner on, so I can see right in Teams, all of my Planner buckets, all the tasks, who they're assigned to, what the status is on that. I can flip that over to the chart or to schedule and see what's happening from that perspective. So Teams becomes that one place where everything is integrated into from a project point of view. And you may have different tabs that you have in here. You may have your own external applications or SaaS applications you want to bring in as part of that. It's totally cool from that perspective. And this is part of Microsoft's vision that Teams, if you were to ask the engineering team at Microsoft, what's their goal for the Teams app? It's to replace Outlook as the one place that people come to and they manage their day. They've got their calendar in there. We've integrated our telco in there. We've got all our Teams and chat and activity feed and files. It's all here. I've got tabs to all my other systems. It brings it all together. And I see that as a big value point for Teams. It's that it's not one part of the puzzle. It's the place that kind of aggregates all that together. So I'm going to skip through a couple of these slides here just in interest of time. I mean, they're there for background in the deck around OneNote and Planner and Stream and some of the things that we've got in there. So the main point of the talk is around provisioning. So what does it mean to provision? Well, the idea is to put some governance around that structure. And as I mentioned, to provide guidance, not hard and fast rules, but if you can template things and make it easy to have them done in a consistent way, people will naturally follow that process. And you can certainly solicit input. Some of our clients, we've spent several months, in fact, having focus groups and understanding that client's business and how their different teams work and structuring what that template should look like. Even at the point of integrating it into Salesforce, into Dynamic CRM, from a workflow automation point of view, we can actually create teams based on triggers happening in Salesforce or triggers happening in dynamic CRM and make that part of the templating process as well. What I'm going to start with is just going back to Matt's infographic here and really saying, you know what, we recommend that you actually turn off the self-service features that are out of the box because they don't give you that control. There is some templating that you can do out of the box with Microsoft, but there's limits around that. And we find that most clients want to go further than that. But the question then becomes, well, if you turn off the self-service, how do people get teams? We don't want to kill the organic growth and the ease of adoption that people can just create a team and start using it. So how do we get that same sort of experience? Well, the key is, don't make it a manual process. Don't have some poor person in IT be the inbox that everybody emails to say, hey, I need a new team, go set it up for me, and it takes days or weeks for that to happen. That's going to kill adoption from that point of view. So what you want to have is some sort of self-service process, and we recommend having some sort of form people can fill out. Maybe it needs to be customized to your organization or to that particular request. And I'm going to show you an open source solution that we've created that we made freely available to help with that process. So we use a combination of SharePoint and Azure Logic Apps, Azure Automation, PowerShell to build this whole process together. You don't have to do it that way yourself. My key takeaway for you from this talk is to figure out your process and put some governance and some structure around that. And there's third-party alternatives. You can say, you know what, I don't want to build stuff. I don't want to do open source. I just want to buy a product and put it in and have it taken care of. One I would recommend is Vattel Teamwork. We are a Vattel partner. Teamwork is their product around this space to say, okay, there's a request form that can be approval processes. There's templates. There's web parts to let you discover teams and join them and such as part of that. So that's one option. AvePoint has a similar one. I don't have the same level of experience to be able to talk to specifically, but it does deal with not just the provisioning, but the management and lifecycle side of it. ShareGate we use a lot from a desktop migration tool point of view, and they've recently come out with their Apricot product, which is all about that lifecycle management. So once a team gets created, who owns it, what happens when that owner is no longer part of the organization, who takes it over, when should it be cleaned up, if it's no longer being used. That's what Apricot is all about. And actually they just recently announced changes to their licensing, that if you're a ShareGate desktop subscription user, you actually get Apricot for your organization as part of that. So go check that out. If you use the desktop product, you have an active subscription there and you're not using Apricot, I encourage you to check it out. Even what we're talking about with the open source solution that we've created, it doesn't deal with the lifecycle management. So something like Apricot is an ideal complement to what we're going to be talking about here. Let's dive into the actual solution that we've created. And to give you a little backstory how it's evolved, it is an open source solution. It is freely available. We're up to version 4 on our GitHub repository that you can pull the components down from. And it's evolved through consulting clients that we have. So as consulting clients have said, hey, we'd love if we had a solution that did this. Well, we've got a starting point with our open source, and then they've funded additional development, which we've actually rolled back into the open source. So all of our clients have been very supportive to say, hey, we want to fund something, but if it can be done in a way that the broader community can benefit from it, we're okay with that. Go ahead and put it back into the open source, and it's now evolved into a fairly sophisticated solution as part of that. So in terms of what the requirements are today for that solution, this is kind of a list that I wrote to say, okay, this is our guiding principle of what we want this solution to do. Well, it needs to be self-service. We don't want to kill adoption, so it needs to be a self-service form for the end users. Approvals if required. Only if required. You can set up the workflow to say, hey, we don't want approvals at all, or maybe only certain divisions or templates require approval, or maybe there's a group of people that are, super users and they skip the approval process. Figure out what makes sense for your organization and put the process in that's the minimal friction possible for the people in your organization so that you do foster that adoption. It needs to be easily extensible and customizable. Each organization has their unique requirements. We've done a number of implementations, like I mentioned, where we've got custom workflow integrations into CRM systems, into line of business systems. SAP is brought in from an integration point of view as well. So the ability to do those integrations. And I'm going to talk more about Power Automate and Logic Apps, which are the workflow tools that we're using here. Those have really rich support for external systems and bringing in those sorts of connectors through there. We're going to be able to leverage both out of the box and customized templates there. So as I mentioned, we have our own Envision IT client-side template, we actually use Microsoft's PnP templating engine. I'll talk about that later, to allow us to snapshot a site and then apply that template to the new teams that are created from there. So it started as a SharePoint focused, as I mentioned, make sure that we've got support for modern sites in there, Microsoft 365 groups, and Microsoft Teams as part of that. And then the last point was an important point for me. I mean, we are a technical organization. We've got quite a number of very competent Visual Studio, C#, .NET Core developer types, but I didn't want to make this a super development focused solution. Yes, there's SharePoint Framework web parts, but you can use them as is out of the box. You don't need to customize those typically. And everything else is all PowerShell driven. So if you've got an IT pro in your organization that understands PowerShell, which is kind of the direction that Microsoft is forcing all IT pros to go in, you should be able to get your head around the solution, be able to not just deploy it, but customize it and tweak it for your organization. And up in the technical resources that I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to put that slide up again at the end. There is white papers from a business point of view as well as from a technical point of view that walk you through the whole solution. So in terms of supporting technologies, I've mentioned these already. We're using Azure Logic Apps for the workflow engine. If you're not familiar with Logic Apps, it's the underlying technology that powers Power Automate. And I'll actually show you live some of the design views in there. And if you've used Flow or Power Automate at all, you immediately recognize them because it's the same designer. Obviously, SharePoint is part of the solution, and PowerShell is a big part of it as well. So let's actually flip over and have a look at the solution itself. So if I come over into my dev site here, we're actually seeing a couple of the SharePoint Framework web parts that are packaged with the solution. We've got the request web part here on the right. We've actually got our sites list web part on the left here. Because one of the challenges as you create lots of teams and team sites, navigating that, finding the one that you're looking for can be a challenge for an organization. So, we've got this concept of sites that you belong to, as well as sites that are visible to you that you can ask to join, as well as an all sites combined view through there. And that can be filtered down. We've got support for hub sites and being able to see just the sites that belong to this hub. Like in our instance, we have a client's hub site, and all of our clients teams and client sites lives underneath those hubs. So this web part can be refined and say, well, only show me the client sites. Don't show me all the other teams and sites in this particular view. And you can have multiple instances of the web part in different parts of your site to help from a navigation point of view. Let's actually dive into the request part, because that's the key part of what we're talking about here. So we start with the concept of division, and there's a bunch of SharePoint lists that drive how this web part works. One of them is a divisions list itself that defines what are my choices in here. You could security trim that and say, hey, only certain people can request teams for certain divisions. However you want to set that up, there's a lot of flexibility from that point of view. I'm going to use this temporary demos one that I have here. And then each division can have one or more templates available to it. We're still calling it a site template here because we're kind of SharePoint focused. I can actually rename that. I should do that as part of this to say, hey, it's actually a team template. We're calling it now. We've got the out-of-the-box templates like a modern team site or a modern communication site. I'm actually going to use this modern client site one here because we've actually applied a template to that to customize what the modern team site looks like coming out of that. And you'll see here, we've got some rules around auto prefixing. So I've picked a particular division. That one says, hey, we want to put a demo prefix on that. So it's immediately obvious when people come in, they know this is a demo team or a demo team site from there. And that applies not just to the title, but to the alias or the site URL that gets created as part of that. And we do auto lookup. If I pick one of these here, like Peter 10, and I start typing that in, it's going to complain and say, hey, that alias is already in use, and force me to choose a different one from there. I'd have to pick a much larger number. Okay, now that works, and I can go ahead and create that. I can set the site visibility. Do I want it to be public or private? We had a third option in here called hidden. That works in conjunction with our web part here. Basically, if you've got a super secret team, sale of the company reorganization, something like that you don't want the organization as a whole to see, you can make that a hidden team, and it doesn't show up in anybody's A to Z or sites list web part unless they're actually a member of that team. And then down here, do we want to create a team as part of that? Do we want to use OneNote? Do we want to create a planner? And you can actually hide these choices and pre-bake them so that when somebody picks a template, It's just configured a certain way. Like, yes, it's always going to get a team. It's always going to get OneNote, and we're not using Planner on these styles of sites. Boom, away it goes from there. We're actually just adding some new functionality around external sharing in here too, to say, hey, allow certain choices in here. Should this site get shared or not? And again, you can pre-bake these choices, hide the choices so that people can't choose, and go from there. In fact, it'll actually define aliases when it's all done here. So if you want like an ext external alias on the front of your site that people know when they come into that team, it's not just internal. You can potentially have external guest users in there as well, that they're immediately aware of that as part of that. And they hit submit, and it basically gets submitted to a SharePoint list. And we can see that list over here. I'm not going to go through the actual request process. It takes a few minutes to actually go through the workflow and create a site, but we can see the details get entered into this list here. People don't normally look at this list itself. In fact, normally we would restrict it that people don't have direct access. There's actually an API that provides the web part access to it, so we can have a security control around it from that point of view. Let's actually jump under the hood a little bit. Let me go over to the Azure portal and just show you some of the moving parts that hang this together. So I'm going to start with the Logic app. So as I mentioned, this is kind of like a flow if you're familiar with flow. So if I come into the edit view on this Logic app, you're going to see the designer here looks exactly like I see in Power Automate, because Power Automate actually uses Logic app under the hood in order to deliver its functionality. It adds some additional, it has a richer approvals process, although there is approvals in Logic apps. But the main reason we chose to use Logic apps is as soon as you start interacting with anything outside of Microsoft 365, including Azure itself, you have to get a premium license for Power Automate. Logic apps doesn't work that way. It's strictly on a consumption basis. It's very cheap from that perspective. So we said, hey, let's eliminate that need on Power Automate licensing and keep the solution simple. And basically what happens is the workflow triggers as soon as something gets written to that site list that I was showing you. So somebody goes to the web part, they request a site, they hit submit. It either gets directly written or it writes through the API if that person doesn't have access into that sites list, and that causes this workflow to start running. And basically, it goes through some initialization of certain variables. It checks to make sure that that site doesn't already exist, because maybe we're just adding an entry to the list, but the site's already there. But if it's true, it does some checks to see, hey, is there supposed to be an approval on this particular type of site? So it checks to see if that's there. And if there is, it goes through an approval process. If not, it just says, hey, mark it as approved and let it continue from there. So it falls out of all that flow there. If it's not approved, it would send a rejection email. And it basically then calls out to Azure Automation that we're going to look at in a minute to actually do the heavy lifting. So that all happens in PowerShell in the cloud from there. Once this successfully completes, we come down here. It either sends an error email to the administrator or it sends an email to the person who requested it saying, hey, your new site's there. If I do a communication site, that's kind of the quickest path through here. Typically 2-3 minutes, that email comes out saying, here's your new site. Modern team sites and team provisioning these days is a little slower. It can be upwards of an hour before that it's fully completed in there. Depends how things are running in the cloud with Microsoft, but they'll still get that response back to say, hey, when that's all finished and they're ready to go, here's your email with your link to your team and your team site. You're good to go from there. So the other side of that is the Azure Automation. So it's all driven underneath what's called an automation account. So Azure Automation is a way to run, .NET executables or PowerShell code in the cloud. And they do run in a virtual machine, but you don't really worry about that. Microsoft takes care of all the provisioning and details around that. And they basically charge you by the minute of consumption that your script is running. It's very cheap. You get 500 minutes per month free, and then it's tiny fractions of cent per minute after that. So if you run up a $1 bill over a month, I'd be surprised, because typically you're not requesting thousands of new teams every month as part of this process. So if we come down into the automation account, we'll see there's a concept called runbooks. And we've got a number of runbooks which each represent a PowerShell script. So this create site runbook, if we view it, we can actually see the PowerShell for it. And all this script is available up in the GitHub repository. It's basically what gets called by the Logic app workflow. So it calls into this, it passes in the list item ID of the request to be provisioned, and it just starts running through, figuring out details of what it has to do for that, and then it actually calls out to some helper functions. So there's a couple of other runbooks in here. The helper one has sort of the core functions that do that provisioning. We actually have this customizations run book. This is where you can put in all of your customizations and tailor the solution to exactly how you want it to work. Because some things you have to do through script, like creating folders or removing content types. PnP doesn't do that for us. So in our client sites, we have this as a sample here. That's what we're doing. So you can bake whatever specific things you want in here. And the idea is you do it in this customizations PowerShell. If we have a new version on GitHub of the core solution, you just deploy that. It doesn't overwrite this customizations, and you've got a nice upgrade path from that point of view. So that's kind of the under the hood, how that hangs together and works from there. So from a governance point of view, what's happening in our environment, when somebody does that request and says, hey, I want a modern client site, and the associated team is part of that. So it creates the team, it creates the Microsoft 365 group, it creates the modern team site, sets up the OneNote. It doesn't actually create the stream group yet because we don't have the API support for Microsoft for that. It can create the planner plan. We can even template out buckets and tasks and planner as part of that. And it sets up all the tabs and teams, so everything's wired together from that point of view. We had a couple of approaches around the channel provisioning. We actually built a web part that you can put into Teams to request new channels. And the idea there was, it would do some additional integration into OneNote and Stream and Planner, which it does do. I'm not super keen on the user experience we had around that. The direction I'd like to go, looking for a client. So if you're interested in helping to fund this, my vision is somebody creates a channel through the out-of-the-box Teams experience, and then we have a Logic App workflow. There's no direct trigger in Logic Apps or Power Automate when somebody creates a channel, but we can have a polling that says, hey, is there a new channel in a team? And if so, start a bot process to say, hey, I noticed you just created a new channel. Would you like to set it up in the standard way and configure the new section in OneNote and the planner for it, yada, yada, and actually have those choices, not as a request form, but as a bot experience right within Teams. And we've done some of that bots development. We just haven't done this particular one just yet. So that's kind of a future vision of where I see that going from that point of view. You get all these pieces wired together and connected up for you. So I've already shown you the request web part through there. And I kind of gave you a quick view of the sites list web part. We see that, if we come back to the home here, we're actually only seeing a couple of views of that. And it's taking its time coming up for me. Actually, let me come back to the PowerPoint here. The cloud's being a little slow for me. So we've got different views. We can have just a straight list. We can see the A to Z if we've got lots of teams that we want to navigate through, or we've got sort of richer tile views that can give you some description of what those groups are as part of that. So I've taken you through the demo already on that. I've gone through the solution overview. So we've got the SharePoint list that tracks the request, the SharePoint framework web part where you enter the requests. I should update my deck. It's no longer Flow. It's actually a Logic App there that fires off from there. We can have approvals as part of that. And then Azure Automation actually runs the heavy lifting from there. So just a little background and links on Azure Logic Apps, Azure Automation. Yeah, it's 2 1/1000ths of a dollar per minute after your initial 500 minutes. So it's actually a really cost-effective way to run scripts and automated tasks up in the cloud. So I talked in the beginning a little bit about the PnP, the patterns and practices. This is an open source project from Microsoft that's really taken on a whole life of its own. It was actually started by a core group of a couple of Microsoft engineers on the SharePoint team. And it became so popular that Microsoft engineering said, you know what, this is now your full-time job. So there's now half a dozen or so full-time people dedicated to that open source project. And there's a huge external community that supports it as well. This is only one piece of it, the provisioning engine. The idea is that you can create a template site. There's nothing special about it. Just create an arbitrary modern team site, for example, and say, now I'm going to tweak that. I'm going to put in the particular site columns, content types, views, lists, libraries, permissions, things that I want to have as a starting site. And you basically run a single line of PowerShell, and it snapshots that site structure into an XML file. And then what you can do is you can take an empty out-of-the-box site that's the same starting point. So if you created your template off a modern team site, then you create a blank vanilla modern team site. You run another one line of PowerShell to take that XML snapshot of the structure and apply it to that new empty site, and you'll get a brand new out of the box site that has all those customizations on there. So any web parts you've done, any views, all of that gets applied in as part of that. So it's a really powerful way to template out the starting point of your modern team site. This is just a little background on the information architecture. We talked a bit about the divisions list, the site templates list, the sites, which is where the requests that get written to. There's a library where you store those PnP templates in there. There's actually more in there. I need to update this information architecture. We've added support for things like blacklists. So if there's certain words you don't want to see appear in the title or the URL, then you can see that as part of that as well. Just wrapping up a bit on the external sharing side of it. There's a number of different sharing options. You can share individual documents or folders through Microsoft 365. You could share an entire site through Azure AD B2B. You could make people guests in the entire team itself, and they could participate in conversations as well as collaborate on documents. We support a very rich structured sharing if you've got very large numbers of external users you want to bring in through our Extranet User Manager product. But really what you need to think about is how you configure sharing in your tenant, both from a tenant level point of view as well as from an individual site collection perspective. And how do you structure that into your request process? If you remember here, I was showing you when I choose this modern client site, I've got some choices around sharing. And as I mentioned, you may want to bake those choices specifically for people so that they have the appropriate things set for the type of team and the type of site that they're requesting through there. And what we do at Envision IT with our clients is we've decided not to bring them into the full team. We have one exception. We have one very large project, about 40 people on the client side involved with about 8 or 10 people on our side. We actually use their team to interact through there. But we find in general, it's difficult for clients to flip between different teams tenants. They like to stay in their own. And if they're a member of ours, they're just going to miss a lot of communications there. So we primarily still use email from an external communications point of view. But what we do is we create a client group in Extranet User Manager, which under the hood creates it in Azure AD. And then we set up permissions in the client site around that. So we share the entire site except for the private documents folder, which is private just for us. And then we have a client documents folder that they have full edit rights so they can contribute into. And we actually have a SharePoint framework web part that we add to the site that allows them to and us to add people in and manage who the members are from that point of view. So think about what makes sense for your organization, both from an internal teams and site provisioning point of view, but also where that's going to get opened up externally and what governance you want to have around that as well. Because you don't want to just shut it down completely from an external sharing point of view. People are still going to share stuff. They're just not going to do it through a sort of an IT approved way. They're going to get their own Dropbox account or secure share or use some other tool from that perspective. And if you want to keep control over it, make it easy for them to do it in a governed and structured way from that point of view. I mentioned this slide at the beginning. I've got links in here. There's lots of articles that we've written around Teams provisioning, white papers available, links to the GitHub repository. So we'll be posting this deck up in multiple places. You can get those links from there. So we're close to the end here. Just some wrap up points to close out on. Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, SharePoint Online, OneNote Planner. These are all great tools to bring together to say, hey, we want to manage projects or different entities within our organization. You don't need to start with all that. You could pick and choose. I had a conversation with an attendee at my earlier talk today saying, hey, do we have to use Teams? Can we just use SharePoint Online from a document collaboration point of view? Absolutely. If you're not ready to dive into the whole team side of things, or you don't want to start using Planner, make decisions as to what makes sense in your organization. But be prepared for change. Microsoft 365 is changing very quickly on a weekly basis. New things are coming out. So keep abreast of that and understand that change management is an important part of how you manage this in your organization. Decide conversation formats, pick for one project. Hey, we're doing email, we're doing Yammer, we're doing Teams. I'm a fan of Teams in general, or email, not so much Yammer from a project's point of view, but decide what makes sense for your organization. Put your governance plan in place. Make sure that that's well communicated, that you've got training and materials around there. figure out what your external user policy is, what your information architecture looks like, if you're going to use site templates, and build some sort of provisioning process around that. As I mentioned, this is my last talk. You can go back to see the recorded sessions. There was an earlier version of this one, as well as my external sharing. We don't have a recording of the VRX therapy one just yet. We had some technical problems. First presentation in VR, in AltSpace VR, so we're hoping to do a repeat of that one and get a recording available for that. From there, I don't see specific questions in the Q&A, but absolutely, if you want to come over into the breakout session, I'm going to jump over in there in a minute. We can have an open mic and have a dialogue back and forth from there.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. As you said, there are no questions in the Q&A, so I guess my suggestion is that we just go over to the breakout room and have discussions and dialogue over there.
I will do that shortly. So I want to say thank you to everybody for attending, and hope you enjoy the last day of conference and you've learned lots from here. If you've got questions, come on over into the breakout session, or alternatively, I've shared my contact information in the deck itself. Feel free to reach out to me there. Thanks and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.